Hello out there, all my bookish friends in BookTube land, and welcome to another episode of Tristan and the Classics. In this episode, we're adding another book in our series 100 Books You Must Read, and this book is the magnificent and famous Jane Eyre by Charlotte Bronte. And even if you've read this book, I'm sure there's something in this video for you. So without further ado, let's dig in, shall we? A great many people class Jane Eyre as their favourite book of all time. In fact, if you go to most reading lists, like the greatest works of all time voted by readers, you'll often find Jane Eyre is sort of battling for first place with Jane Austen's Pride and Prejudice. But when asked, why does the book touch you so deeply? What is it? A lot of readers can't quite put their finger on what makes this book so brilliant. And in this video, I'm hoping that I can give an answer to some of that, give various reasons why Jane Eyre is such a standout book amongst the classics. Now, one of the hallmarks of a great classic, because not all classics are equal, there can be classics because they are the beginning of a particular genre which others followed. Others have more impact because someone manages to put to words and in a well thought out structure the experience of their life so accurately, so precisely, so well thought out and coherently, I think might be the word, that millions of others recognise it as something they deeply feel too. It's like a resonating force, and it gets a whole mass of people vibrating as one, to use an analogy. Jane Eyre is one of those books. Charlotte Bronte, it's said, wasn't an authoress who liked to write with a purpose, as in she didn't have a principle or an idea that she was trying to preach or definitively explore. Now, although that's said, I'm not totally sure it's true, especially in the case of Jane Eyre. And we'll come to something that's in the book in a moment, which gives me my reason for saying what I've said. Because there's something about Jane Eyre that you can't help but sense that it is Charlotte Bronte. Now, I don't know much of Charlotte Bronte's personal history, but there's too much leakage, I think, into the book of her experience. And I do think she has an outlook which is the same as Jane Eyre's. But before we go into all of that, let's just go over a brief synopsis of the book. So Jane Eyre is the story of a young girl who grows up with her aunt and her cousins, and it's her progression through life. You see her develop as a character as she moves from one place to another. And she starts off mistreated by her aunt and her cousins and eventually gets sent to a boarding school where she's taught various aspects of being a well-accomplished lady. The boarding school itself is not a finishing school as such. It's quite down and out. It's pretty low. In fact, its name is Lowood School. And she makes some connections there, and she gets an insight into the way of the world, and she begins to show her discontent. She's a very spirited girl. When she starts at home with her aunt, she's very spirited, and people try and crush that spirit. Her aunt thinks she's a naughty girl. Later on, when she tries to be a little bit rebellious at the school, she's crushed again. And she's forced into conformity. You see the whole wearing of the school uniform, the attire, which is very bleak and dowdy. And yet she keeps looking out of the school at the surrounding countryside and yearning for what is over the horizon. The deep sense that all humans have of exploration, of adventure, of daring do. Now eventually Jane grows up and she leaves the school. I can't remember what age she is, and she gets a place as a governess at Thornfield Hall, where you've got the famous Mr. Rochester who she meets. He's the owner there. He's this single man. He's quite brooding and dark, and he's got a charisma, but it's a bit menacing, the charisma, and he's quite irreverent, a bit inappropriate. And Jane well, she's had a lot of her spirit. She's learned to control her spirit, not let it out, to be proper. And she is very, very moral. And she has absolute standards. And that's the thing. Although she's learned to sort of put the brakes on her feelings and her nature, she still has lines, moral lines, that she won't bend. And she is quite frank at times with Mr. Rochester. And you see this toing and froing between them. And she's at the disadvantage because, of course, she's the governess of Mr. Rochester's only child. And because he had an affair in his past. So, you know. Anyway, so she is at a disadvantage because she's a lowly person. Here he is with this great haul. But she can't help but be drawn to the attention he shows her. It's not necessarily romantic attention, but it's personal attention. And he asks her questions, and he's blunt and forthright. He says, "Do you think me handsome, Jane?" I mean, fancy asking that. This is like the 1850s, isn't it? Maybe before. And she frankly answered him, "No, sir." And he loves this. And sometimes she gives the correct answer to start with, and he always pushes her, saying, "No, I know you don't think that. I want you to speak honestly with me." And she finds it a bit affronting because he seems to disregard all the delicacies, niceties, the graces that are expected in refined society. But nonetheless, she is drawn to him as a character. And then she meets the world that he runs in, high society. And she compares herself suddenly, after being alone with Mr. Rochester and his servants for quite a long time. She then sees him in the company of those who are his equals in society. And although he doesn't kick her out, she feels inferior. She is ridiculed, derided, secretly laughed at by those who are in a higher station than she is. And she's accomplished in drawing, and she draws a picture of herself and another girl who's trying to get the attentions of Mr. Rochester, called Blanche. And she notices that she's a plain-looking girl, whereas Blanche is beautiful and accomplished and everything. And it just reminds her that despite this sense of adventure that she has looking at the countryside, she's stuck in a position. And funnily enough, about the countryside, when she looks out of the grounds of Thornfield Hall, she often thinks about what is over the horizon, and that one day she'll go out and make her way. If she can save enough money, she might become an independent woman and be able to explore. Now, as the book moves on, as you know if you've read it, if you haven't, there's not really many spoilers here. She has to go to another place for a while where she meets another few characters. There's two sisters and a brother that she meets, and the brother's called St. John. It's actually St. John is how it's written, but when you pronounce it, St. John, you wouldn't keep calling someone St. John. Eventually it's St. John, St. John, St. John, St. John, St. John. So that's how you read it, St. John. She meets him, and he is a highly moral man. He's very pure, almost puritanical. He wants to go on a missionary tour. And she really admires his faith, his decency, his commitment to things. And she senses that he may like another girl in the area, and she tries to help out in that area. She really gets on with the two sisters, because she relates to them, and they're so easy, and they sit and spend time together in this little house, you know, doing things and talking. And she is free to roam outside as well, which is quite amazing. Now, I'm missing an awful lot of the book here because I don't want to give spoilers. And then finally, the book wraps up with, obviously, Mr. Rochester and Jane. You know, how does their relationship finally come to a conclusion? How satisfying is that conclusion? And what about St. John and Jane? Is there anything between them? That's pretty much the synopsis of the book without spoilers, okay? So now let's go into looking at the layers and meaning of this book, which makes it such a great piece of work. So what is Jane Eyre actually all about? What's its deeper meaning? Did Charlotte Bronte have a purpose in writing it? I'm not sure she actually started with that in mind, but we're all influenced by our experiences. And what's so great about this book is it's got so many levels on which you can look at it. The way she executes her story, the reason it touches us so deeply with its mood and atmosphere, and also its very recognisable message is what determines that it was going to always be a classic. In fact, when it was released, it was extraordinarily popular in its day and still continues to be. But before I go into a particular part of the book, I just want to have a chat about the name, Jane Eyre. This gives something away about the book. Why Jane Eyre, do you think? If I were to say the name Jane, think of a phrase that uses the word Jane in it. Plain Jane, okay? Now, I believe the first time plain Jane was used was somewhere in the mid-1700s. And it referred to someone who was not necessarily good looking, particularly ordinary, maybe even ugly. But it later became associated with the Quakers, would you believe? Because the Quakers had a particular way of dress, not ostentatious. And that's something you find in this book. When she goes to the school, there is a very bleak grey outfit that she has to wear. When she goes as a governess, she wears the same habit. And when she's got the option to wear finer clothes, she feels very uncomfortable about it. It's a very Quaker-like attitude. And the Quakers were called plain Janes. That's what it became to refer to. And of course, there's a hangover now, isn't it? If you don't dress flamboyantly, you're a plain Jane. So that's Jane. Why Eyre? Did you know Eyre is actually a word? It's sort of an archaic now, it's sort of out of use. You can find it in the legal area because it is a legal thing. And Eyre was when a judge or a court would travel through the land, making its rounds, settling disputes, rendering judgments, etc. And so an Eyre was a journey. It was a journey in which you rendered judgment or came to a conclusion. So Jane's journey, it's the journey of a young girl, a plain girl, maybe even a religious, moral girl, like the Quakers, and it's her journey. So how fascinating is that? And that's something about this book. Names are outstanding in this book. There's a reason for them, and you can learn a lot from them looking into them. But before we do that, and we're going to, I just want to read you what is fundamentally the underpinning idea of the whole book. If you've watched many of my videos, you'll know that I talk about books, the classics in particular. They tend to have a linchpin scene or comment. It's not so much a whole scene. There is an idea which is breathed out by the protagonist or someone where you can't help but think this is the author speaking. This is, whether they mean it or not, this is what they believe or are thinking about when they're writing this book. And sometimes that may have come, not deliberately, but as they're writing, ideas come to mind. And if you want to know one way of finding that idea when you read, go and look at my video on how to read a book well. It's quite popular as one of my videos goes, and I get a lot of feedback from people at university about how useful that video is. So if you want to get into the classics, I recommend you go and read that, watch that. I'll put a link in the description. But in chapter 12 of Jane Eyre, we find the Linchpin Paragraph. And I'm not going to paraphrase, I'm going to put it on screen. We're going to read the whole lot because this is the soul of the book. It is in vain to say human beings ought to be satisfied with tranquility. They must have action, and they will make it if they cannot find it. Millions are condemned to a stiller doom than mine, and millions are in silent revolt against their lot. Nobody knows how many rebellions, besides political rebellions, ferment in the masses of life which people earth. Women are supposed to be very calm, generally, but women feel just as men feel. They need exercise for their faculties, and a field for their efforts as much as their brothers do. They suffer from too rigid a restraint, too absolute a stagnation, precisely as men would suffer. And it is narrow-minded in their more privileged fellow creatures to say that they ought to confine themselves to making puddings and knitting stockings, to playing on the piano and embroidering bags. It is thoughtless to condemn them or laugh at them if they seek to do more or learn more than custom has pronounced necessary for their sex. Isn't that a brilliantly put together bit of writing? Doesn't that sum up the feelings of people? Now, even men can recognise those feelings, although not on the male versus female setup of society, particularly in the 19th century. But that yearning for finding adventure, action, not being content with one's lot, being stifled by society's expectations of you, and being ridiculed if you seek to get out of it. All of Jane Eyre is based on that idea, that notion. At the beginning of the book, she is a spirited young girl. But her aunt, whenever she speaks her mind against her aunt, whenever she challenges her for being too strict, too abhorrent to her, Jane gets thrown into the Red Room, where she's locked in. And it's a punishment for feeling the way she feels. It's a punishment for being herself. Now, Charlotte Bronte, something she does really well in this, she uses a little cameo role of her young cousin at the beginning of the book. And he's a little terror. He knows his mother will always look on him as a darling, and he knows that any trouble can be put onto Jane, and he just loves getting her beaten and in trouble and locked up. And she says to him, Jane Eyre says to him, "You are like a murderer. You are like a slave driver. You are like a Roman emperor, a tyrannizer, someone who wants to make others subservient to them and not let them rise above their station." Now, this idea is carried on as Jane goes to the school later. And in that school, you have the headmaster, and he's just the same. It's supposed to be a spiritual, religious school, something that brings you closer to God and has strong values and morals. Now, there's nothing wrong with strong values and morals, but this guy is a tyrant. He is a Roman emperor. He is a slave driver, almost a murderer, as he causes the girls to lose any will to live. And so Charlotte Bronte is passing judgment here on the hierarchy of the day, because women were in their place. Even if they were beloved by their husbands and within the family setting, they could get on, and there was in the village, they had a good time, etc. In society as a whole and societal expectations and propriety, women were subject. You didn't get an adventurous woman back then, and yet she says, we have as much yearning as our brothers, men, have. So to keep us stuck down in the house, cooking puddings, embroidering bags, you can't mock a woman for wanting to go beyond that. And Jane epitomizes this. She's always got this deep yearning, and we get to see it from her perspective. She explains herself so well. And so Jane Eyre, the book, becomes the story of a journey of a plain Jane as she tries to find satisfaction and happiness in life. And it's through true love. There is an exploration in this as well about what true love actually is. But I want to talk a bit more about the names in this book, because there's a lot to learn from them as an insight into what's going on in Charlotte Bronte's mind. And as you know, our life doesn't follow a particular thread like a novel does. What a novel does is it makes sense of our experience of life. It puts it into relief so that we gain a meaning from it. And the use of names in this book really puts a structure in. Now, I want to start with the names of the houses that Jane stays in. She goes through 5 different houses in the book. She never returns to stay at any one of them, which is interesting, isn't it? That's life. it's a journey. I'm going to put on the screen now the 5 places that Jane actually goes and lives at. And then we're going to just explore something very curious about them, which I think you'll really like. So you've got Gateshead Hall, Lowood School, Thornfield Hall, Moor House and Ferndean. On the face of it, there may be nothing interesting about this, but I want you to take a look closely. In Gateshead Hall, this phrase head, or word head, that's a promontory. It's a feature of the landscape, isn't it? A head, a headland. And then the school is Low Wood. It's another aspect of the landscape. Thornfield is where Mr. Rochester lives and where Jane goes as governess. Moor House. A moor is a broad expanse, isn't it? You think of the Yorkshire moors. Okay, so another feature of the landscape. And then this last one, Ferndean. Although it's actually one word, look at the second syllable, dean. I don't know if you know this, but the word den comes from dean. Den is a sheltered area, isn't it? Well, a dean is a valley, normally a smaller valley, which is shaded by trees and normally has a running stream. That's a dean. So in all of the place names that Jane lives at, you find a feature of the landscape. And guess what? In all of the sections, you find a description of the landscape, except for one of them. And all the way through, Jane yearns to be exploring what is over the horizon of each landscape. The yearning for adventure, just as we've looked at in that quote from chapter 12. The yearning to get some meaning. But that's not the only thing about these names. Let's go back to these names again, and we'll find something about the experience of life in these names as well. So we had head in the first one, but look at the first syllable, gate. Gateshead. She is locked in. She is confined, trapped, not able to be herself. When she goes to the school, it is low wood. She's pushed down. Not simply for being a woman, but also because this is poor as well. She's not going to be anybody in society. So low. She's submitted in her experience of the world. When she goes to see or work for Mr. Rochester, it's not just field, but it's thorn. It troubles her a lot. She goes through pain because she has to do a job which she doesn't particularly love, because she wants to save up to move beyond the horizon, to maybe be able to find meaning in life of her own, to be independent. So it's Thornfield. You're beginning to get the idea, because this is the experience of many people as struggle through the journey we call life. And then there's Moor House. House is different. It seems a little more comfortable, a little more enjoyable. But you notice it's not more home, is it? House is not a home. And then you have Ferndean. And this one, we could think, breaks the mould. Because what's fern? Well, remember, quite popular in the 19th and the 18th century was the symbolic language of flowers and birds and various other things. But flowers especially have the language of flowers. There was an old book called that. Now, a fern, symbolism in literature, is good luck, especially for new lovers. How interesting is that? So through all the names of all the places, she never stays at one place, she moves through, and it's actually marking the Jane Eyre. Remember, Eyre is a journey? It's the plain person's journey through life, trying to improve it. Can you get to the idyllic Dean, Ferndean, the good luck living in a protected valley? That's very insightful, isn't it? I think that's genius of Charlotte Bronte to put that together. But I want to talk about 2 other names that are in the book. One is Mr. Rochester and one is St. John, the 2 main male figures that Jane has to interact with. Now, there's something ironic about both of their names. And we'll start with Mr. Rochester. Mr. Rochester is brusque, he can be rude, he can be too forthright, lack manners, inappropriate, you could say. And yet his name, Rochester, well, Roch comes from, I mean, there is a French term for this, but there's also the word for roof in English. The Anglo-Saxon is close to roch. So roch tends to mean a place of security, like having a roof over your head. Chester is a Latin word frequently found all over Britain in place names because it means fortified camp, a fortified station. There is the city of Chester, which was where a Roman fort was. And anything with Cester in it, so Worcester, it says Worcester, or Cirencester, or Colchester, all mean there was a fort, a fortified encampment for the Romans there. So Rochester means a fortified place of calm and safety, of security. Because roch is a roof, it's a calm place to dwell. Now that's ironic because he's a very turbulent character. He keeps moving away from the house while Jane's there, leaving her, you know, for ages on her own. So that's fascinating. And yet, well, we'll come to it in a minute. The other one is St. John, or St. John. Now, St. John is a very cold character in this book. He's extraordinarily moral, highly religious, bordering on the puritanical, probably is Puritan, wants to be a missionary, wants to help others, is very interested in Jane, has a deep respect for her as a person, and Jane really respects his values. She respects his self-restraint and composure. But he's got a hardness about him, almost an unforgiving, unrelenting, unbending manner of persona. And there's an irony in that as well, because his name is St. John. Now, if you know anything about the scriptures and the apostles of Jesus, St. John was called the Beloved. He's known as the apostle of love. He's supposed to be the most loving. In fact, in the Gospel of John, you'll have more references to the quality of love than Matthew, Mark, or Luke. And so Charlotte Bronte has given this character the name of love, St. John, and yet he's quite the opposite. He's cold and aloof. Rochester means a secure place of calm, and yet he is very turbulent, wild, inappropriate. And what's wonderful about Jane Eyre is, despite the fact that their characters have negative traits, she does not judge them purely by the outward manifestation. She sees into them and values the good in both. And you see her developing as a person. She's beginning to observe what truly makes a good person, beyond just the theoretical, and how you can be happy with somebody and what true love is. And this is, you've got these two characters who in many respects symbolize the two halves of society. Those who seem to be hedonistic, those who seem to be very upright. But what lies beneath? What's the real character? So that's one of the things that guides this book, and I think you sense it as you're going through. So just, if you've forgotten these, just go back and look at what the names all mean again, and maybe jot it into your book. If you're doing this for GCSE or A-level, this is worth noting down. If you're just learning yourself the classics, this is worth putting in the front cover of your book, these names and what they mean. Now I want to come on to a fascinating aspect of this book. It's one of the things that sets it out as a trailblazer amongst novels. And that is what creates its atmosphere and what gives it that rudimentary, primeval connection to us. Why are we so gripped and enthralled by Jane Eyre? It has a very, very heavy atmosphere in it, which puts you in the scene. How does Charlotte Bronte pull this off? This is just remarkable. And if you're a writer, there's a lot to learn from this. This is a Gothic book. And if you want to understand Gothic literature, what makes something truly Gothic, I really recommend you look at another video of mine, which is, I think it's the 8 aspects or 7 aspects of Gothic literature. And I'll put the link in the description. Please, please, please go and watch the 2 videos that I've suggested here. You really will benefit in your understanding of literature. Now, Gothic is popular because it hits the sublime, it hits the awe-inspiring, it works on terror, unease, when we are small in the face of life as a whole and we become aware of it. We all have that sensation in ourselves. And Gothic plays on that. But what's so great about Jane Eyre is she subverts the Gothic genre. Now let's just have a quick look at how she does this. So, in the Gothic genre, you have the supernatural often. Something like prophecies or hidden passages or ghosts and spooks or something like that. There is something menacing beyond your control. Now, if you've read the book, you'll know exactly what I'm talking about here. There is funny goings on in the night at Thornfield. There's bumps and cackling, and there's one night early on when Jane is in her room and the door's locked and the handle starts to turn and shake. And there's no putting a finger on what this is, this supernatural environment that's going on. And it's contrasted with this maid called Grace Poole, which again, look at the name, Grace, which is goodness and calm, and Poole, you know, calm waters, but still waters run deep. Okay, so there may be something in her name as well. So you have this element of the supernatural and threat always present with her. In fact, at the beginning, she's put in the Red Room and she fears that she's going to be visited by a ghost. I think it's of her uncle, who's supposed to have died in that room. So the supernatural plays its role. There is also a fortune teller, an old hag that comes along and reads or foretells, reads the palms and the futures of some of the guests that are at Mr. Rochester's house. And that includes all the high society ones, but Jane is also there, and the hag wants to talk to every woman in the house, and so Jane has to go in, and this hag starts telling her things about herself and about her future potentially. And it's all very unearthly, puts everybody on edge. But after introducing us to this unease, Jane Eyre, the book, subverts that. It uses the idea of the supernatural to produce an effect, but it's not really supernatural. And in fact, the supernatural is being abused at times willfully by characters in the book. But it still gives us that feeling, but now it tethers us to real life, a life we could live that is believable. That's one aspect of the Gothic. Another aspect of Gothic literature is the strong man, the man who comes in and saves the damsel in distress. Now you have two main figures in this book. Each have an interest in Jane. To what level that's romantic, that's for you to decide. But they both have an interest in them. However, you see her need for the men through her time in the book. And yet, Charlotte Bronte subverts the idea of the man saving the woman, because fundamentally, Jane Eyre saves the men. She is their salvation. They need her more than she needs them. The way the book ends is highlighted by that. I'm not going to give a spoiler away in this. There's a lot I could say, and it needs an in-depth review where I can give spoilers. But if you've read it, you'll know what I mean. It's subverted. The powerful male figure is actually, they are powerful men, but you find their flaws, their weaknesses, and it's actually the woman that helps them. So that's another aspect. Metonymy is used quite a lot. If you want to know what metonymy is, go and watch that video that I've put in the description before. There's doubles. So again, Rochester and St. John, they're a double of each other. Thornfield and Gateshead. And Morehouse. They juxtapose one another constantly. And what about the happy ever after? That is beautifully subverted in this book. I mean, outstanding how This book would not have the same effect without the way the ending takes place. Most Gothics have this happy ever after, which pulls everything together. Does that mean that this book isn't happy ever after? Well, that's up for you to decide. It's not like completely disastrous. So there is much going on in the Gothic genre here that she uses. And what we've already mentioned as another part of Gothic, because it's an outgrowth of Romanticism, is the place of nature. So you have things like a lightning strike, and it's at a particular point in the book which signifies separation because it strikes a particular tree and splits it. So there's symbolism there. There's other parts which, if you haven't read it, you won't get this, but if you've read it, Jane, Jane, Jane. Do you remember that bit in the book? This comes, you know, it's tied up in nature and gives you this broad connection in life which spans time and space. So there's so much about this book that is Gothic, which appeals to us. It's highly popular. You think of all murder mysteries, sensational novels, they're pretty much based upon the Gothic outline. But what Charlotte Bronte does in Jane Eyre is she takes the aspects of Gothic and twists them around into real life, showing you that your life is a Gothic story in many respects with realism thrown in. I'll give you one other detail about this element of the Gothic and the inherent journey that we're all on. Look out when you're reading in Jane Eyre, look out for references, not overt references, you have to read between the lines, but to fairy tales. So there's a bit where Mr. Rochester comes close to Jane and she says, you know, she look at his large face and his great nose and those teeth. Now that's the big bad wolf, isn't it? What large nose you've got, what great teeth you've got. Okay, it's the big bad wolf, and she's Little Red Riding Hood that's come through a wood to get to Thornfield. There's Cinderella in this, if you look carefully. Someone that's a lackey, that's subjugated, trying to meet their Prince Charming. Bluebeard is referenced directly in this book. Bluebeard locked up his wives in cupboards. He murdered them and locked them up in cupboards. And there's Jane walking through the halls of Thornfield Hall at night, and you know all these doors and what's behind them. There's that. There's a reference, you could say, to the Ugly Duckling. There's so much. And what's great is the fairy tales all touch on an aspect of humanity which is real, which is recognisable, but they're also Gothic. And they're used to create an atmosphere which is then strangely kept whole and snapped at the same time. Because you know that this is not an unrealistic story. This is the story of a real girl. I feel that this may well be semi-autobiographical, not deliberately. But if you've seen a picture of Charlotte Bronte, I mean, there's no actual extant photos, but she's not the best looking, and I don't mean that slightingly. I'm just talking about her day. Jane is not a great looking character. There's nothing extraordinary about her looks, and yet there's so much emphasis placed on that today as well as back then. But she's saying it doesn't stop you having a great character inside. What's remarkable is Mr. Rochester and St. John, neither of them are particularly good looking either. This is all about the character. And how do you get real happiness? Where does true love really reside? And genuinely, because it is a love story, genuinely, she does get to the crux of where true love resides. And when you think of the fact that so much emphasis is placed on looks behind the scenes, because she refers to herself and to Rochester, she refers to Blanche, this beautiful woman, it's interesting how it ends. For those of you who have read it, think about how it ends and how that pertains to your looks, a person's looks and a person's character. How interesting, eh? You'll know what I mean if you've read the book. So, that is the overview and some insights into the brilliant Jane Eyre by Charlotte Bronte. It is definitely up there with 100 books you should read. And a lot of her insight comes from being a governess, the same as her sisters, Anne and Emily. And in fact, The Tenant of Wildfowl Hall by Anne Bronte is also on my list of 100 books you should read, which is in a playlist, and we're slowly adding to it. So I hope that you've enjoyed this video. Please, please, please leave a comment down below. What were your thoughts of Jane Eyre? Is there anything in this video that has added to the colour and understanding of why it's such a good book? Please comment, and I'll do my best to answer you. I can't answer all comments anymore because I get too many now, but I will try my very best to get to you. Until the next time I place a video, I wish you joy in your reading.